The initial intrusion went unnoticed by me, a mere oversight. The second occurrence, however, I documented. By the third instance, they arrived with an aerial device, and I countered with a shotgun, a trusted companion I'd christened Eleanor. That marked the commencement of our entanglement, not with raised voices or overt threats, but with a simple assertion of territorial rights against an encroaching boundary. Many perceive Texas as a landscape defined by arid plains and livestock. Yet for those of us who inhabit it, the dust is imbued with ancestral significance, and the cattle represent a heritage. This very soil bears the imprints of every footfall, the perseverance of every fence post driven deep, and the silent prayers for rain that went unanswered. It holds history, much like a man carries his scars, unseen by most, but undeniable to those who understand its depth. My name is Jed Graves, and I've been tending this expanse of land since I was a boy, shadowing my grandfather as he replenished feed bins. 280 acres, scorched by the sun, dotted with stubborn cedars, bound by barbed wire, and steeped in an unyielding sense of dignity. This entire domain is safeguarded by a land trust, established by my grandfather in 1954, a time when a man's word was his most binding contract. This property isn't designated for commercial use, nor is it a residential development, and it certainly operates without the oversight of any homeowners association. People frequently inquire why I've never relinquished my claim, why I persist in this remote existence as the urban sprawl relentlessly advances. The truth is, large gatherings hold no appeal for me. I've always found solace in solitude. It's not a dislike of people, but rather a preference for the quiet company of cattle. They offer no gossip, no deception, and certainly never appear at your doorstep, beaming with an agenda for contrived harmony. My core beliefs are threefold: the sanctity of boundaries, the virtue of honesty, and the dignity of labor. A fence line is not mere ornamentation, it is a solemn promise. Respect for what is yours ensures respect for what is mine. This was the established order on this parcel of earth until their arrival disrupted it. I recall that particular morning with crystalline clarity. The air hung heavy, perfumed with the comforting sense of hay and diesel. I had just completed repairs on a section of fence near the southern pasture when their presence became apparent. They stood at the gate, a picture of urban perfection, as if they had stepped directly from a glossy magazine. Their smiles were wide, their footwear immaculate, and not a bead of sweat marred their polished exteriors. The woman held a clipboard, a symbol of their structured approach, while the man wore the placid, disarming expression so characteristic of those accustomed to imposing their will. "Mr. Graves," she announced, her voice as bright and artificial as a songbird that had lost its way, "we represent the Welcome Committee for Sage Hollow Estates." I chose not to respond immediately. Instead, I deliberately wiped the dust from my hands, rested my weight on the fence post, and met their gazes directly. They possessed that familiar presumptive look, the one that silently declares, "We have already determined what is best for you." This was their initial transgression, the first instance of someone stepping onto my property and behaving as though they held dominion over the very air I breathed. Even then, I afforded them the benefit of the doubt, assuming they were simply new neighbors, unaware of the invisible line they were about to cross. However, my assumption proved to be profoundly mistaken. You see, this place, the barn, the fences, even the tranquil pond nestled by the cedar grove, is more than just acreage. It is history solidified into the very soil, a testament to years of effort and dedication. It represents what remains when the superficial and ephemeral fade away. And once you have dedicated a lifetime to preserving something through drought, financial hardship, and the relentless march of time, you cannot simply permit anyone to redraw its borders simply because they have acquired a residence with a digital access code. Therefore, when they first appeared, I let the matter pass. The second time, I chose to record their intrusion, and the third encounter, well, that was the turning point, the moment I realized this would transcend a simple neighborhood disagreement and evolve into an educational discourse on the fundamental principles of Texan ownership. Because out here, a man's land is not merely where he resides, it is an intrinsic part of his very identity, and certain lessons are best imparted only once. They christened their development Sage Hollow Estates, an ironically chosen name for a place devoid of any sagebrush and lacking any discernible hollows worth exploring. It was merely a collection of residences crammed adjacent to my southern boundary. Identical rooftops, meticulously manicured lawns, and fences uniformly painted in a shade of subservient white. It resembled a suburban cloning experiment transplanted into the heart of the countryside. They advertised it as an escape to the country, a peculiar paradox of experiencing rural living without the actual rurality, and precisely that it was, a manufactured semblance of freedom. I observed its construction from my rear pasture, witnessing its incremental assembly. First came the heavy machinery, their relentless excavation scarring the earth as if performing an unsolicited surgical procedure. Subsequently, the garish promotional flags and ostentatious signage emerged, accompanied by the cloying aroma of fresh asphalt and the insidious scent of unfulfilled promises. I remained silent. It was not my concern. I believed individuals possessed the inherent right to live as they pleased, provided they respected the sanctity of their own boundaries. However, a crucial lesson learned in this environment is that sooner or later, someone invariably interprets your fence as an open invitation. That particular Sunday morning, the atmosphere was so clear that one could perceive the distant curve of the river. I was engaged in the task of mending wire on the southern perimeter when the distinct crunch of gravel behind me signaled their approach. Two figures stood at the gate, a man and a woman, both appearing to be in their early 40s, dressed impeccably as if en route to a leisurely brunch, not a rustic farmstead. The man offered a perfunctory wave, the kind that betrays a practiced, insincere smile. The woman, clutching her clipboard with the tenacity of a law enforcement officer displaying their badge, called out, "Mr. Graves," her tone excessively cheerful. "We're from the Sage Hollow Estates Welcome Committee, simply extending a greeting to our new neighbors." The word neighbors typically carries a weight of mutual regard in this region, but her pronouncement transformed it into something akin to an administrative onboarding process. I advanced deliberately, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow with my forearm and leaning against the fence post, deliberately withholding any verbal response, allowing the palpable silence to establish an unsettling tension. She cleared her throat. "We're holding our inaugural Community Improvement Forum next week. We'd greatly appreciate your input, particularly concerning fence uniformity, lawn maintenance standards, and livestock visibility." I raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. "Livestock visibility?" She nodded with the practiced ease of someone describing a novel gourmet coffee blend. "Some of our residents have voiced concerns regarding agricultural aesthetics. We're striving to ensure a cohesive visual presentation to uphold property values." It was at this juncture that I interrupted her. "Madam," I stated firmly, "I am not a member of your community. This is private property. It always has been." Her smile faltered momentarily, only to resurface with intensified artificiality. "Well, technically," she began, "the county records indicate your property is adjacent to Sage Hollow." "Adjacent," I reiterated, "is not synonymous with incorporated. I have signed no agreements. I contribute no dues. I adhere to no regulations, and I certainly have no need for your meetings to dictate the appropriate height of my grass." The man responded with a polite, condescending chuckle, evidently mistaking my defiance for jest. The woman blinked, then made a brief notation on her clipboard. "We simply wish to ensure everything remains harmonious," she replied. I offered a single, decisive nod. "We've achieved a considerable degree of harmony on this side of the fence." They departed shortly thereafter, after exchanging a few more hollow pleasantries and vaguely mentioning future social gatherings. As they retreated, I observed the man casting a backward glance and discreetly taking a photograph of my barn. That was the initial photograph. Unbeknownst to me at the time, it would not be the last. Over the subsequent weeks, their visits became more frequent. While the faces and their greetings varied, the underlying message remained consistent, always accompanied by the ubiquitous clipboard and the pretense of neighborly concern. I began to hear recurring phrases such as visual cohesion and shared expectations. These elegant euphemisms all conveyed a singular, unspoken sentiment. They disapproved of the presence of my cattle and the appearance of my fences. Initially, I maintained a cordial demeanor, reiterating the same assertion to each visitor. My land is not subject to your homeowners association. You do not contribute to the tax revenue here, and therefore you do not establish the rules. On one occasion, I even produced the trust deed, a document predating their very existence, and held it directly before a woman's face. She barely deigned to look at it. However, she remarked, the spirit of the law is also important. I responded with a slow, deliberate smile. The spirit of the law, I countered, does not delineate property lines. That marked the end of my attempts at polite discourse. The encroachment began subtly, akin to unseen rot, gradually weakening the structural integrity of wood. One week it was a friendly knock, the next a casual stroll by. Then 3 individuals pausing to take photographs from the roadside, behaving as though they were observing exhibits in a museum of obstinacy. I maintained a logbook on my kitchen counter, meticulously recording dates, times, and names whenever I could ascertain them. This was not born of paranoia, but rather from the ingrained principle of documenting interactions when individuals begin to challenge established boundaries. In this domain, empirical evidence carries far greater weight than mere opinion. By the 3rd month, their visits had established a discernible pattern. Different individuals, yet the same carefully modulated tone, always cheerful, always feigning ignorance of the clipboard, serving as a weapon in their hands. They posed their questions with that disingenuous sweetness that only urban dwellers seem capable of mastering. Have you considered updating the barn's exterior siding? Wouldn't your property appear significantly more inviting without barbed wire? My responses were concise, at times reduced to a mere unblinking stare, yet they persisted nonetheless. Then the drones appeared. The initial one buzzed over the pasture on a still Wednesday morning, its sound resembling a disoriented hornet. The cattle remained unperturbed. I, however, did not. The device hovered at a low altitude, its camera emitting a faint red light directly above my hay barn. I gathered a handful of gravel and hurled it, the impact against the drone's casing audible and sufficient to cause a noticeable wobble. I watched as it retreated southward, back towards Sage Hollow, like a chastened cur. I harbored a brief hope that this incident would mark the cessation of their intrusions. However, precisely 3 days later, another drone materialized, newer and noticeably quieter. They had adapted, and so had I. That weekend I journeyed to a bait shop located just beyond Basrap. I made an anonymous cash purchase of 4 trail cameras and a pair of discrete audio recorders. I strategically positioned 2 cameras within birdhouses, one concealed within an old feed bucket near the gate, and the final one discreetly placed within a weathered cedar post. The microphones were cleverly disguised within repurposed coffee cans, rendering them outwardly unremarkable precisely as I intended. If they intended clandestine surveillance, I would allow them to ensnare themselves through their own invasive curiosity. A week later, the recorded footage became available. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, illuminated by the glow of my laptop, a mug of lukewarm coffee beside me. There they were, 2 individuals standing just beyond the fence, engaged in hushed conversation. The man, attired in a blue polo shirt buttoned to the collar, bore the unmistakable insignia of the HOA on his chest. The woman, sporting tortoiseshell glasses, held a clipboard beneath her arm. The audio captured enough to be revealing. Man, the recording clearly stated, if we submit this under safety, animal control will be compelled to intervene. Exactly, the woman's voice responded. We'll assert that the livestock are malnourished. The ordinance will handle the rest if we present it strategically. I paused the video, allowing the implication of her words to resonate in the quiet darkness, a low hum like a taut wire. Their intentions were not merely nosy, they were actively plotting. I advanced the footage further. One individual was captured halfway over my gate, a camera dangling from his neck, Another was seen employing a laser measuring device on the fence posts, muttering about non-conforming architectural elements. Over a period of 9 days, 9 distinct individuals appeared. 6 of them made multiple appearances, clearly establishing them as repeat trespassers. I began meticulously labeling each video file with timestamps, names, and even license plate numbers whenever discernible. I refrained from sharing this evidence, neither with the sheriff's department, nor with the county officials, nor even with the attorney I had yet to contact. I was determined to compile a comprehensive record. One does not reveal their hand prematurely when the dealer is still stacking the deck. Then one evening, as twilight deepened, I detected that faint familiar hum again. It's a sound one learns to recognize after countless quiet evenings spent under the open sky, a drone flying low and southbound. I retrieved my flashlight and proceeded deliberately at a measured pace towards the pasture. This time, it hovered directly over the pond, its camera tilting like an unblinking eye, devoid of any shame. I directed the beam of my flashlight precisely at it, observing the reflection shimmer like a fleeting bolt of lightning off glass. It was then that I issued my warning, my voice carrying clearly. Fly over this land one more time at this altitude, and I will personally demonstrate to you the principles of gravity. The following morning, I discovered fresh tire tracks adjacent to the southern gate. They belonged to the identical model of SUV I had observed at least twice in the recorded footage. Someone had parked there under the cover of darkness. While they did not breach the fence this time, their footprints, clean, expensive, and undoubtedly new, were clearly visible. It was at that precise moment that the full scope of their strategy became apparent. They were not merely attempting to harass me, they were actively probing for weaknesses. Every visit, every aerial surveillance, every ostensibly polite conversation served as a calculated pressure tactic. Prolonged pressure, they presumed, would eventually lead to a breaking point, and once a man breaks, they can readily label him as dangerous, thereby shifting the legal advantage to their side. Their objective was to orchestrate a headline: "Local farmer confronts HOA, escalates dispute." They desperately sought a public outburst, a moment of lost composure. I did not oblige them. Not yet. Instead, I intensified my own preparations. I acquired 2 additional surveillance cameras, installed motion-activated floodlights, and upgraded all the locks on the property. I even meticulously compiled a personal incident report documenting dates, video evidence, and still frames, all printed and sealed in protective plastic sleeves. I understood the typical narrative of such disputes. The individual rooted in the land is invariably cast as the antagonist. If they intended to transform my life into a case file, I resolved to preempt them. 3 days subsequent to the last drone sighting, I noticed a fresh set of tire tracks near the eastern fence. They did not belong to any vehicle I recognized. They were too narrow for typical farm equipment and too pristine for county vehicles, retaining their showroom tread. That afternoon, while attending to a leaky valve along the irrigation line, a silver SUV calmly pulled to a stop beside my gate, its engine idling as if anticipating my reaction. The driver emerged, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in crisp denim and desert boots that had never encountered mud. He leaned casually against the hood, his demeanor relaxed, his smile polite yet undeniably manufactured. "Mr. Graves," he called out. I merely nodded, my wrench still in hand. "My name is Brian Lee," he introduced himself. "I'm affiliated with a private investment group based in Austin. We're currently assessing legacy land parcels, and yours came to our attention." I remained silent, observing him over the fence. He chuckled softly, as if he believed his placid demeanor could outlast my reticence. "Relax," he said, opening a folder with a sheen reminiscent of a snake's scales. "I'm not with the HOA. In fact, I've had my own share of less than amicable encounters with them. They're urban dwellers playing cowboy, if you ask me." That particular remark nearly elicited a smile from me. Almost. He slid a document from the folder, holding it just high enough for me to glimpse a figure substantial enough to command serious consideration. "We have an offer for you," he continued, "significantly above market value. No pressure, but this area is undergoing rapid transformation. You're sitting on a gold mine, Mr. Graves." It was then that I deliberately placed my wrench down, straightened my posture, and truly appraised him. I noted the way his gaze repeatedly drifted towards my barn, the fact that he already knew the precise acreage, and the faint, woodsy, expensive cologne that clashed jarringly with his boots and his contrived narrative. "Do you engage in this practice often?" I inquired. He blinked. "Do what?" "Approaching individuals with unsolicited offers near boundaries you're not permitted to occupy." He responded with a smile that suggested he perceived my question as a compliment. "Only when the circumstances warrant it." I took a step closer to the fence. "Drive that way," I instructed, gesturing down the road, "until you can no longer see barbed wire, then continue onward." He hesitated, then emitted an easy laugh, the kind a seasoned salesman employs when met with polite rejection. "Look, Mr. Graves, I understand. You're attached, but everything has its price, even heritage." "Not mine," I stated firmly. "It's not for sale, not for lease, and certainly not for you." He closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and departed without further comment. However, his lack of argument was precisely what unsettled me. Individuals of his ilk do not typically depart empty-handed unless they have already secured their objective. That evening, I meticulously reviewed the footage from the trail cameras. As expected, 3 nights prior to our brief exchange, the identical silver SUV was parked approximately a mile down the road, adjacent to the ancient live oak. I observed the same individual engaged in conversation with the woman wearing tortoiseshell glasses, clipboard in hand. She handed him a manila folder. He, in turn, presented her with a check. So much for his assertion of not being affiliated with the HOA. I sat in the darkened kitchen, the faint glow of the screen reflecting off the tin ceiling. My coffee had grown cold, but a simmering rage provided a sufficient warmth. They were no longer mere irritants. They were orchestrating a calculated maneuver. One faction exerted pressure, while the other engaged in covert acquisition. It was a clever strategy, I conceded. Plan A had failed: harass the farmer and provoke a breakdown. Thus, Plan B was initiated: offer a financial incentive and induce complicity. Had I accepted that check, even for a fleeting moment, they would have possessed grounds to claim I had entered into negotiations. That is all it takes to distort ownership in legal proceedings dominated by developers. However, they fundamentally misunderstood a crucial point. Certain men cannot be bought. This is not due to any inherent virtue, but rather because they have already paid their dues in time, in sweat, and in the enduring legacy of those who came before them. This land represents my grandfather's commitment, my father's weathered hands, and my own identity indelibly linked to these cedar posts. Such a legacy is not for sale. It is to be fiercely protected. Consequently, I printed every frame of that incriminating footage documenting Brian Lee beside the SUV, the woman with the clipboard, and their clandestine exchange. I placed it within a plastic sleeve labeled Plan B Evidence. Then I positioned it on the table alongside Eleanor, my grandfather's shotgun. One tool for legal recourse, the other for potential conflict. Regardless of the method, I was certain they would return, and when they did, they would not find a man willing to be purchased. They would find a man prepared for whatever came next. They did not return for further discussion. They returned to sow discord. That is the unmistakable indicator that the pretense of civility has evaporated, the noise subsides, and the damage begins to manifest at dawn. The first tangible sign of their escalation appeared in the form of a stark white envelope placed in my mailbox. It bore no postage and no return address. Inside, a printed complaint alleged livestock odor and health concerns, asserting my violation of air quality standards under a specific HOA bylaw, a regulation entirely inapplicable to me or this county. I emitted a brief, mirthless laugh, tossed the document onto the burn pile, and momentarily believed that would be the extent of their actions. 3 days later, a white pickup truck rumbled up my gravel driveway. The lettering on the door identified the occupants as representatives of the county's Agricultural Oversight Department. 2 men alighted, one masticating gum with an air of palpable displeasure. "We've received a complaint regarding animal welfare," the lead individual inquired. "From whom?" I responded. "We are unable to disclose that information." Predictably, they inspected the stalls, documenting healthy cattle and measuring feed bins as if meticulously cataloging evidence. One of them attempted to open the barn door. I intercepted him with a look that conveyed a clear, unambiguous message: "Do not proceed." After approximately an hour, they departed, muttering something about a routine follow-up inspection. 2 days later, a different truck arrived, bearing a distinct logo but delivering the same rehearsed script. Representatives from the Environmental Quality Commission stated that a report had been filed concerning potential chemical seepage near my lower pond. There were no test kits deployed, no samples collected, only clipboards and a camera. That night, I discovered 2 large garbage bags discarded near the southern gate. They contained fragments of broken drywall, rebar, and insulation scraps, appearing as though a demolition trailer had been emptied onto my pasture. The following morning, a gentleman from code enforcement knocked on my door, inquiring about an unauthorized dumping incident. "That's peculiar," I remarked. "Let's go take a look." We walked down to the site together. I pointed to the camera discreetly mounted in the oak tree above the gate. "I can retrieve the surveillance footage," I informed him. "You'll observe a white van arriving at precisely 3:42 a.m. and discarding this debris over my fence." He didn't even complete his sentence before retreating. It was at that moment that the full extent of their strategy became undeniable: death by 1,000 bureaucratic citations. They were not intending to seize my land by force, but rather to overwhelm me with regulations until I could no longer function. Then, one night, the conflict shifted from subtle pressure to outright aggression. It was just past midnight when I heard it. A dull, metallic thud from outside, akin to a strained chain giving way. I retrieved my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, Eleanor in hand. The night was unnervingly still. No wind rustled the leaves, no moon pierced the darkness, only a primal instinct that the natural order of things had been disrupted. Down by the eastern fence, my gate hung askew, its locking chain severed cleanly through. Tire tracks curved outwards, disappearing toward the county road, deep impressions etched into the damp earth. A wave of dread washed over me. The cattle. My heart pounded as I ran along the fence line. A dozen head were missing, the gate gaping open. I activated the radio, contacting Deputy Ruiz on the channel Avery had provided. It took 4 hours and the deployment of 2 patrol vehicles to divert traffic while I painstakingly herded the stray cattle back into their enclosure, using only a flashlight and a bucket of range cubes. As the sun began to ascend, the exhaustion of the night settled into a cold, hard resolve. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a legal office associated with Sage Hollow. A woman's voice, crisp and tinged with smugness, informed me, "We have received numerous reports concerning loose livestock from your property, posing a significant community safety risk. Have you considered relocating them to a more suitable environment?" I offered no reply, simply terminating the call. That evening, I reinforced every gate with industrial-grade double-link chain and heavy-duty locking hardware. I installed motion-activated floodlights, powerful enough to startle the dead. I upgraded all my surveillance cameras with enhanced telephoto lenses, working continuously until sunrise. The following morning, a soft, steady hiss, unmistakable in its clarity, woke me. A tire was losing air. By the time I reached the tractor, both rear tires were completely flat, slashed deeply with a knife. Resting on the workbench beneath the shed, I discovered the irrigation control tablet, its screen shattered and its casing visibly caved in. Someone had once again trespassed onto my land, venturing close enough to detect the scent of oil on my tools. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. That profound silence held a tangible weight, and a primal unease crawled up my spine. There's a deep-seated resentment that you believe you've shed, yet it remains anchored within you. It starts in your core and solidifies in your very being. I went indoors, retrieved my firearm from its case, and brought out Eleanor. The wooden grip felt familiar against my shoulder, like a handshake from times gone by. I loaded her deliberately, one cartridge at a time, just as my grandfather had instructed me when respect was a tangible virtue. Afterward, I settled on my porch, observing the sky transform into hues of orange. The livestock meandered in the distance, possessing a serenity akin to saints, and it struck me how curious it is that creatures can coexist peacefully while humankind contrives reasons for conflict. A part of me yearned to drive directly to Karen Steedman's picture-perfect porch and offer her a genuine taste of a Texas welcome. However, an instinct deep within cautioned me to delay, recognizing that whoever was orchestrating these events was not yet finished, and I was no longer willing to play a defensive role. The morning following the destruction of my tractor, I was still on the porch when the distinct sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed up the driveway. This time, it wasn't stealthy, but rather measured and official. A county patrol car, white and green, glided to a halt beside the barn. The door opened, and Sheriff Avery Lawson emerged. It had been quite some time since I'd seen Avery in his official capacity. The last instance was perhaps 15 years prior, when he was a deputy assisting my father in extinguishing a grass fire behind the shed. Back then, his hair was a full, dark head, and his smile could disarm a coiled rattlesnake. Now his hair had turned gray, and his easygoing grin had been supplanted by a more hardened expression. He leaned against the car door, squinting in my direction. "Well, Jed," he stated, "you look ready to start a war." I offered no verbal response, merely gesturing towards the crippled tractor beside the barn, its rear tires slashed. The tablet resting on the workbench lay shattered like a broken egg. Avery approached, stooped down, and traced a finger along the gash, his jaw tightening. "You understand this wasn't random," he commented. "I have security cameras," I informed him. "They entered through the drainage culvert, wearing gloves and hoodies. They knew the blind spots." He straightened up, brushing the dust from his knees, and surveyed the surroundings with a slow gaze. "They're becoming quite brazen." He then lowered his voice to a near whisper. "You might want to take a seat." I remained standing. He let out a sigh. "Very well. Here's the situation. We've received information. One of the Homeowners Association board members came forward, a younger gentleman new to the neighborhood who stated he could no longer condone what was transpiring. He provided us with a recording." Avery reached into his coat pocket and produced a small flash drive enclosed within a folded note. "Jed," he said, handing it to me, "this is significant. Karen was captured on audio discussing a scheme to poison your pond. Sufficient synthetic fertilizer to trigger an Environmental Protection Agency alert. Their calculation was that by rendering the land appear contaminated, the county would be compelled to intervene, seize the property, or rezone it out from under you." I simply stared at the drive. There was no need to inquire about its contents. I recognized the scent of deception when it was described. Avery continued. "She stated, and I quote, 'If we can't force him to sell, we'll make it unbearable for him to remain. It's all documented on that recording.'" For a considerable minute I remained silent. Then I exhaled slowly and finally sat down on the porch steps. "She's aiming to break me, Avery, to transform my land into a burden." He nodded. "And she's escalated from mere HOA disputes to criminal conspiracy. We've already brought in the district attorney." I glanced down at the drive in my hand. It felt heavier than lead. "I have video evidence as well," I disclosed. "Dates, faces, license plate numbers, even that smooth-talking investor they sent, Brian Lee, but I cannot directly connect him to Karen. Not yet." Avery jotted something down in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. "We'll investigate that angle. If he's involved in this coercive effort, we will uncover the link." I rose, brushing the dust from my jeans. "What's the next step?" Avery met my gaze directly. "Now, Jed, we cease playing defense." He offered a faint smile, not one of reassurance, but rather one that signaled an impending escalation. Gather your documentation, every recording, every timestamp. I'll put you in touch with an attorney who specializes in land disputes and possesses a formidable reputation. He turned to depart, then paused at the car door. One more thing, he stated. Be cautious about who you confide in. Karen has allies within county departments. She's accustomed to winning through intimidation. I nodded. Then she's chosen the wrong man to intimidate. He let out a low chuckle. That's precisely what I told the district attorney. The cruiser kicked up a plume of dust as it rolled down the drive, leaving me alone with the flash drive resting on my knee. I turned it over once, then twice, reflecting on my grandfather's likely advice. It would have been something straightforward like poison remains poison, regardless of how appealing the container appears. Inside the house, the laptop hummed to life as it booted up. Outside, the morning sun was brilliant enough to make the pasture shimmer as if the land itself awaited my action, and in that moment I understood this was no longer about property boundaries. This was a conflict, not one waged with ammunition, but with evidence, perseverance, and the truth, the kind my grandfather would have endorsed. That night, sleep eluded me. The flash drive sat on the kitchen table like an unexploded ordnance, small, unassuming, yet burdened with immense implications. My entire life had been dedicated to rectifying tangible issues, mending broken fences, repairing faulty valves, tending to ailing livestock. Now I faced a challenge that couldn't be fixed with physical force. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the metal roof and carrying the scent of mesquite and diesel. It brought to mind my father's voice when he would say, "Some battles, son, you cannot win with your hands. You must win them with your mind." I never particularly embraced that lesson. By morning, news of the unfolding situation had spread throughout the county. Not from me, but through the same channels of gossip that invariably surface when scandal is afoot. A neighbor sent me a link. Rachel Ortega, an online reporter who managed a website focused on property rights, had picked up the story. The headline read, "Local farmer harassed by HOA." Below it, 100 comments and one stood out like a lit fuse. I liked this guy. The choice between filing, trespassing, and chambering a 12-gauge works. I read it twice, then let out a dry chuckle. The kind of laughter you offer when someone finally articulates a thought you've been harboring. They weren't entirely wrong. The easier path for me would have been to retrieve Eleanor from the truck, drive directly to Sage Hollow, and conclude the matter in the conventional manner. However, the part of me that still recalled my grandfather's words cautioned, "Don't exchange your integrity for a headline." So, I poured myself some coffee, sat by the window, and gazed at the flash drive once more. Avery's words echoed in my mind. We stopped playing defense. By mid-morning, I dialed the number he had scribbled on the back of his card. A woman answered, her voice steady, firm, yet calm. "Lindsay McReynolds," she identified herself. "Sheriff Lawson mentioned you might be calling." "Jed Graves," I replied. "I have some individuals attempting to transform my pasture into a legal entanglement." She chuckled softly. "That's one way to phrase it. Tell me what you have." And so I did. The surveillance footage, the drone recordings, the fabricated complaints, the acts of vandalism, and the flash drive detailing the pawn scheme. When I finished, there was a pause long enough to hear her breathing over the line. "Mr. Graves," she said finally, "this isn't merely harassment. This is organized coercion. What you're describing could lead that HOA to years in court." I found myself liking the sound of that. "So, what's our course of action?" "We go on the offensive," she declared. "Civil, environmental, and criminal charges if they hold. We'll file with the EPA, the county, and the State Land Commission, and we will ensure every single one of those smirking antagonists is held accountable under oath." For the first time in months, I experienced a sensation akin to relief. Not peace, as peace felt too distant, but a sense of purpose. Lindsay spoke with the same dispassionate certainty I'd once heard from drill sergeants when I was a younger man. After we concluded our call, I took a stroll down to the pond. The water was tranquil. A few dragonflies flitted above its surface, and for a fleeting moment the place appeared unchanged, yet I could sense the weight of their intentions, the attempt to transform clean water into a weapon, to render my land a liability. I knelt, ran my hand through the grass, and felt the damp earth between my fingers. It was then that I made my decision. I would not allow anger to dictate my narrative. I would allow the evidence to do so, because bullets do not alter perspectives, but truth can dismantle empires. I walked back to the house, opened a fresh notebook, and inscribed 3 words at the top: law before lead. Then I began the process of organizing everything: dates, video files, transcribed conversations, photographs. Each item was meticulously placed into a binder, labeled much like a soldier's field log. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows from the oak trees, I possessed a formidable collection of evidence, requiring no actual ammunition. That night, Rachel Ortega telephoned. She had obtained my contact information from Avery. "I wish to share your story," she stated. "People need to understand what's truly occurring." I invited her to visit, but only after I had submitted the necessary legal documents. She agreed. "Just one thing, Mr. Graves," she added before disconnecting. "What's your contingency if they intensify their efforts?" I gazed out across the field, where the motion-activated lights swept across the fence line like slow-moving lightning. "My plan," I replied, "remains the same. Keep my powder dry and my attorney on speed dial." A few days after I resolved to pursue this matter through legitimate channels, fate presented a test of my resolve. I was stacking feed sacks near the barn when I noticed dust rising on the county road once more. For a fleeting second, I assumed it was Avery, or perhaps Rachel. However, as the silver SUV came into view, my gut told me otherwise. Brian Lee. He parked near the same section of fence as before, emerging more slowly this time. No briefcase in his hands, no sales pitch in his smile. He approached the gate, hat in hand. "Mr. Graves," he began, "I believe I owe you an apology." This gave me pause. "I didn't expect to see you again," I remarked, "nor did I anticipate returning." He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It transpires that the HOA has been utilizing me as an intermediary for matters I was unaware of. Following our last discussion, they withheld one of my payments and attempted to hold me accountable. It seems you've discovered the nature of the people you're dealing with." He nodded. "Indeed. And if you're still inclined to turn the tables, I may have a means to assist." While I didn't entirely trust him, I also didn't trust coincidence. So I listened. He explained his prior experience working with property developers, his understanding of their tactics, their methods of pressure, and their propensity for cutting corners. "Karen is desperate," he stated. "She's losing ground with the board, but she still has allies on the county planning committee. If you intend to defeat her, you must provoke a reaction, and nothing incites her panic more swiftly than a loss of control over the narrative." I leaned against a fence post. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" He grinned. "Have you ever operated a backhoe?" I chuckled, despite myself. "Every man out here has operated a backhoe." "Excellent. Then begin excavating." That weekend, I borrowed my friend Hank's backhoe, maneuvering the large yellow machine from the shed and positioning it near the south pasture where Sage Hollow's view was most unobstructed. I spent the better part of 2 days digging 6 trenches, meticulously straight and sufficiently deep to appear noteworthy from a distance. To any observer, it likely suggested the commencement of a significant construction project, perhaps septic systems or the foundation for a new dwelling. I erected no signage, offered no explanations, simply continued working until I noticed a silver SUV slowing at the ridge, presumably to capture photographs. Monday morning, the whispers began. Rachel called to inquire about my activities. "The internet is abuzz," she reported. "They believe you're installing retention ponds or preparing for construction." I smiled. Let them speculate. By Tuesday, my first visitor arrived. A man in a short-sleeved dress shirt bearing a Sage Hollow insignia strode purposefully up the lane. "Mr. Graves," he commenced, "we've received reports indicating you are conducting unauthorized excavation work that could pose a public safety hazard." I produced a folder. Within it were county-approved documents from 1972 and a recently filed permit through the Agricultural Board, stamped and signed just 3 days prior. Runoff control trenches, I explained. State-sanctioned. They aid in erosion mitigation and pond overflow management. You gentlemen always emphasize your commitment to environmental preservation, do you not? He blinked, as if I had just delivered a dose of common sense directly to his face. We simply wish to ensure compliance. You wish to ensure I remain the antagonist, I countered, but you are welcome to review the permit. He did not, instead retreating with a mumbled remark about community diligence. That evening, the surveillance cameras captured an event I had been anticipating. A pair of headlights crept down the lane, moving slowly and cautiously. A man disembarked, one of Karen's frequent visitors, the same individual I had observed previously, using a laser tool to measure fence posts. He proceeded along the trench line, a flashlight in hand, attempting to peer into the excavated pits. The footage then shows his boot slipping. He tumbled waist-deep into one of the freshly dug holes, dropping his flashlight and letting out a curse audible enough to startle the cattle. I remained perfectly still, watching him scramble out covered in mud, limping back towards the gate, attempting to clean himself with a towel that only seemed to worsen his appearance. By sunrise, I had already downloaded the footage, labeled it Trespass 14, and made copies onto 3 separate drives, one for Avery, one for Lindsay, and one for my personal records. Let them attempt to fabricate a narrative in court. When Rachel called again, I shared my strategy. She erupted in laughter, so intensely I thought she might drop the phone. "Jed, that's brilliant. You didn't even need to set a trap." I grinned. I didn't have to. They stumbled into it out of their own curiosity. Brian stopped by later that day, carrying a thermos of coffee. He stood beside me, observing the morning sun glinting off the trenches. "They believe you're constructing a fortification," he remarked. "Good," I replied. "Sometimes the mere idea of a barrier can be more intimidating than the barrier itself." He regarded me for a long moment, then nodded. "Karen is going to be incensed when she discovers you filed a permit." "That's the objective," I said. I didn't articulate it aloud, but I felt it resonate within my chest. The tide had finally turned. They had spent months attempting to portray me as a criminal. Now, for the first time, they were the ones contemplating my next move. And nothing unnerves bullies more than realizing the individual they provoked possesses patience, documentation, and a backhoe. By the close of September, the air carried the initial crispness of autumn. The mesquite leaves had faded to a dull hue. The mornings dawned with a quieter disposition. And for the first time in months, I could almost hear my own thoughts. Almost. Because even as the cows grazed, and the fences remained intact, I knew the conflict was not concluded. It had simply transformed its character. Lindsay called one morning from Austin. "Jed, I have news," she announced. "We're not the only ones." It turned out that 2 families within Sage Hollow, the Langstons and the Wettas, had come forward after encountering the article Rachel had published. They had acquired their properties under the premise that the adjacent land, my land, was slated for acquisition and subsequent development. They had even paid premium prices for the anticipated access to the nature corridor. When they discovered I had no intention of selling and never had, they were incensed. "They are prepared to testify," Lindsay stated, "and they possess documentation that traces directly back to Karen's real estate agent." A faint smile touched the corner of my mouth. For months I had stood alone on this soil, defending every inch with resilience and persistence. Now for the first time, I was not alone. That afternoon, Sheriff Avery stopped by. He had that particular expression he wears when a situation has deteriorated, yet in a way that might ultimately prove beneficial. "Jed," he said, "the district attorney's office is reviewing Karen's financial records. It appears some HOA funds were diverted through a shell landscaping company. Does that name ring a bell?" I offered no verbal response. He already knew the answer. "Cypress Horizon Contracting," he supplied. "That's the name printed on Brian Lee's initial folder, the investment group." I leaned back against the porch railing, exhaling slowly. "Well," I remarked, I suppose that serpent is finally revealing its tail. Avery nodded. We'll apprehend her, Jed. It's merely a matter of time. Keep your cameras operational and resist the urge to retaliate. I recounted the incident with the backhoe trenches and the manufactured panic they had instigated. He laughed for a full 10 seconds. Hell, Graves, you just executed a psychological ambush. You might have missed your true calling as a strategist. Not strategy, I corrected. Just common sense. Occasionally, one must make the devil question the sermon being delivered. A week later, Rachel Ortega drove out once more. Her truck rattled down the lane, enveloped in a cloud of dust. Camera equipment was piled in the rear. She emerged dressed in jeans and work boots, appearing more at ease on a ranch than most reporters I had encountered. "Morning, Mr. Graves," she greeted. "Mind if I take some updated photographs for the follow-up piece?" "As long as you don't deploy a drone," I stipulated. She grinned. "Promise." We ambled leisurely across the property. I showed her the repaired gate, the reinforced locks, and the 6 trenches still concealed beneath tarps. She posed questions with the thoroughness of a true journalist, driven not by the pursuit of headlines, but by a desire for genuine understanding. Then, her demeanor shifted to seriousness. "Jed," she stated, "people are talking. You've become something of a symbol. Landowner versus HOA. David versus Goliath. What is your ultimate objective in all of this?" I gazed out over the field. The cattle grazed against a sky painted gold by the evening light. "Not notoriety," I replied. "Merely peace, and perhaps a reminder that freedom is not exclusive to gated communities." She nodded, making a note without further comment. That night, the 5 of us convened at Avery's office. Myself, Lindsay, Avery, Rachel, and Brian Lee. Brian appeared somewhat apprehensive, like a man attempting to erase an indelible stain. However, he delivered. He presented a flash drive containing a trove of emails and text messages that detailed direct coordination between Karen and the real estate agent responsible for selling the Langston and Ojeda families their homes. Included were financial transfers, fabricated claims, and even instructions on how to paint me as a hostile agricultural element. Lindsay almost let out a whistle upon viewing the contents. "Jed," she declared, "this is no longer merely a lawsuit. This is a reckoning." We laid out the entirety of the evidence. My footage, their contracts, Karen's voice captured on Avery's original recording, and Brian's documented paper trail. It was sufficient to construct a case so robust it could serve as the foundation for an entire structure. When we concluded, Avery stood with his arms crossed. "I will present this to the district attorney in the morning, but you should be aware that Karen will not surrender without a fight. She's the type to set the house ablaze if she perceives herself as losing." I nodded. "Then we must ensure the fire burns in the courtroom, not on my pasture." Everyone concurred. We shook hands, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a semblance of unity, a peculiar sensation for a man who had spent half his life deliberately avoiding his neighbors. Yet sometimes, even a solitary rancher recognizes the wisdom of riding alongside a united group. It's a peculiar sensation, witnessing individuals who believed themselves untouchable finally face consequences. The day of the trial arrived like a storm whose scent precedes its visible manifestation. Downtown Austin, the courthouse, a structure of marble and flags, the air thick with apprehension and the cloying scent of perfume. I had exchanged my work boots for a pair of polished shoes that felt alien on my feet. Lindsay stood beside me at the plaintiff's table, as composed as a surgeon prior to an operation. Behind us sat the Langstons, the Uetas, and a half-dozen strangers who had gathered simply to ascertain if justice still prevailed. Across the aisle sat Karen Steedman, her hair impeccably styled, her posture perfect, her makeup applied like a protective shield. Her attorney offered a smile that resembled a serpent's, slow and practiced. The judge, a woman in her 50s, possessed eyes sharp enough to cut through granite. As she called the court to order, the entire room seemed to exhale in unison. Lindsay commenced the proceedings with the established timeline. Every visit, every correspondence, every fabricated complaint, the photographic evidence, the drone surveillance, the logs of trespassing incidents I had meticulously maintained as if they were entries in a diary etched in steel. Then came the audio recording. Karen's voice, flat and cold. "If we can't make him sell, we'll make it impossible for him to stay." The ambient temperature in the room palpably dropped by 10 degrees. Even the judge leaned forward. Karen's attorney attempted an objection, mumbling something about context and community protection, but the assertion lacked credibility. Lindsay remained relentless. Her next witness was Brian Lee. He appeared changed, remarkably subdued. The very individual who had once approached my property line, attempting to purchase my life's work, now stood under oath, detailing to the court how he had been contracted to pose as a potential investor. He meticulously presented evidence of payments, electronic correspondence, meetings, and even the establishment of a shell corporation. The jury absorbed his testimony with the rapt attention of observers watching a cascade of dominoes topple. It felt as though the matter should have concluded at that precise moment. However, in Travis County, while we were ensconced in that courtroom, an unrelated event was unfolding. Approximately at noon, Avery's phone vibrated. He leaned in, conveying information to Lindsay and then to me. "Jed," he stated softly, "there's activity at your property. The security footage shows a vehicle and 2 individuals near your pond." A chill permeated me. "They're attempting to obliterate the evidence," I declared. Lindsay's eyes ignited. "Avery, can your deputies manage this?" He nodded, already composing a text message. "They're en route." I compelled myself to remain seated, though every fiber of my being yearned to be present on that land with Eleanor in my grasp. Yet Lindsay gently squeezed my arm and murmured, "Allow them to expose themselves, Jed. You've already laid the groundwork." Out at the ranch, Deputy Ruiz and a pair of officers arrived just as the 2 men were transporting bags of fertilizer towards the pond. They froze beneath the bright lights. "The cameras I had installed weeks prior were already recording," Ruiz informed me later. Stepping out of her patrol car, her hand resting near her belt, she addressed the men. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said. "Do you have authorization for that?" They offered no reply. One attempted to flee, while the other dropped his load. Within minutes, both were in handcuffs, seated on the ground as the deputies relayed the situation. The truck was registered to a landscaping firm, Cypress Horizon Contracting, the very entity Brian had identified in court merely an hour earlier. By the time Avery received the confirmation text, Lindsay was once again interrogating Brian. "Mr. Lee," she stated, her voice both measured and sharp, "you previously mentioned the company name, Cypress Horizon. Can you confirm who sanctioned that particular payment?" He gave a nod. "Karen Steedman." Karen's complexion paled with such rapidity one might have imagined a switch being thrown. The remainder of the proceedings unfolded like a silent film. Environmental Protection Agency officials took the stand, corroborating that the deliberately planned contamination would have necessitated an emergency federal intervention, resulting in an automatic seizure of the land. In essence, Karen had attempted to exploit legal mechanisms to unlawfully acquire what she could not purchase. Her attorney fumbled through an explanation about a misunderstanding, but the jury remained disengaged. Their attention was fixed on Karen, her hands trembling, her lips pressed into a thin line. I experienced a fleeting, almost imperceptible wave of sympathy for her. Almost. By late afternoon, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. The charges included conspiracy to commit property sabotage, forgery, harassment, and the falsification of environmental data. The judge's gavel descended with a resounding crack that echoed like distant thunder rolling across an open plain. The sentence was 7 years in a state correctional facility, coupled with a perpetual prohibition from holding any office within a homeowners association or a corporate entity. And just like that, the protracted conflict had concluded. Yet, I abstained from immediate celebration. One final destination remained. That evening, I drove back to the ranch. The sun was descending, its orange hues blending into shades of purple. Deputy Ruiz stood by the gate, arms crossed, a subtle smile gracing her lips. "We apprehended them in the act," she remarked. The entire incident was captured on video. They even divulged who dispatched them. I offered a knowing nod. It appears justice found its way home. She glanced beyond me toward the excavated trenches in the field, now filled with rainwater from the preceding night's downpour. It seems you dug the appropriate kind of holes after all, she observed. I chuckled. Perhaps I did. As she departed, I walked toward the pond, stopped at its edge, and gazed out over the water. It remained pristine, vibrant. All that they had sought to pollute, still teeming with life. It was at that moment that a realization dawned upon me. I had expended so much energy defending this land that I had, in fact, forgotten the appearance of tranquility. Now I remembered it resembled reflection. Calm water, an unobstructed sky, and no further footsteps intruding from the wrong side of the boundary. They say that after a storm subsides, the air possesses a distinct quality, fresher, imbued with a sense of wisdom. It is possible that this is merely the sensation of profound relief speaking. 2 months had elapsed since the conclusion of the trial, yet on certain mornings I still awoke with the residual expectation of hearing engines at the gate or the hum of drones overhead. Instead, the only sounds now were the rustling of wind through the cedars and the deliberate mastication of cattle grazing in the pasture. Peace. The kind that goes unnoticed until its absence is felt and then its return is savored. The Travis County Land Commission made the dissolution of the Sage Hollow Estates HOA official the previous week. Their assets were frozen and the board members were levied substantial fines. It transpired that my ranch was not the sole property they had attempted to ensnare. 3 other landowners subsequently came forward presenting identical forged maps and spurious boundary demarcations. When the narrative surfaced, it transcended my individual struggle, evolving into a testament for every man and woman who had ever stood at a property line and declared, "Thus far and no further." Rachel Ortega aptly termed it The Reckoning. Her investigative article was disseminated across every newspaper from Houston to Amarillo, followed by coverage from CBS and then NPR. Before long, I found myself the subject of widespread attention, the farmer who had triumphed over the system. I had not sought this notoriety, but neither did I shy away from it. Occasionally, individuals require tangible proof that ordinary citizens can indeed achieve victory. Correspondence began arriving in my mailbox, handwritten notes from as distant as Wyoming and New Mexico. The majority expressed gratitude. A few contained photographs of their own fences. One gentleman even mailed me a handcrafted belt buckle inscribed with the words, "Private land, public spine." That particular gesture elicited a hearty laugh from me. It seemed I had inadvertently become the emblem of unwavering persistence. Sheriff Avery paid a visit one morning, bringing breakfast tacos and a folded newspaper. "You've achieved official celebrity status," he announced. "Front page news." There I am, standing outside the courthouse, hat in hand, the sunlight perfectly catching the brim. The headline proclaimed, "The farm that refused to yield." He grinned. "I told you we'd shift from defense to offense." Brian Lee also stopped by later that week. He appeared like a man who had finally experienced a full night's sleep. "I've had enough of that world," he stated. "Developers, HOA dealings, the entire lot. Are you hiring?" I responded, "Certainly, as long as you don't mind early mornings and honest labor." A smile spread across his face. "That's precisely what I'm seeking." It's quite remarkable how redemption, at times, simply requires an additional pair of willing hands and a fresh beginning. The barn has since undergone a renovation. It's been repainted a vibrant red once more, the color my grandfather had always maintained. The Langston family graciously assisted with the trim one weekend, and the Ojeda family contributed a delicious pie. Our conversations rarely veered toward legal disputes or permits. Instead, we focused on work, the weather, and the integrity of our fences. That was more than sufficient. Rachel returned for a concluding interview. Her familiar pickup truck was present, as was her characteristic grin beneath her sunglasses. We traversed the property once more, this time at a more leisurely pace. She recorded supplementary footage of the pond, the barn, and the sign I had constructed and affixed to the front gate. Its inscription read, "If you are from the HOA, turn around. We remember you. We did not like you." She emitted a burst of laughter so vigorous she had to steady the camera. "You could have added a skull and crossbones, you know," she quipped. "No," I replied. "The words suffice." As we settled onto the porch, she posed the perennial question that marks the culmination of any narrative. "So, Jed, what lies ahead?" I contemplated her inquiry for a considerable duration, observing a hawk gracefully riding a thermal current above the fields. "The same as before," I eventually responded. "Tend to the livestock, mend what breaks, keep my gates secured." She smiled. "You truly believe it is over?" "Not for them," I affirmed. "There are countless other HOAs out there who believe themselves to be superior to the very ground they occupy. However, perhaps next time they will reconsider." She meticulously noted this down, closed her notebook, and surveyed the pasture. "Well," she remarked, "at least now they understand the wisdom of not provoking a Texas farmer armed with a shotgun and a thoroughly documented case." We both shared a laugh, the sound carrying across the landscape like a resonant bell, clear, definitive, and liberating. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Avery's patrol car once again appeared. He presented me with a bag from Whataburger, saying, "Breakfast for tomorrow." Inside, I discovered a folded copy of that identical newspaper photograph. Myself, Avery, and Brian standing beside the new sign. He had utilized a marker to extend a caption across the top, identifying me as the man who had reminded Texas of the purpose of fences. I affixed it to the barn wall, precisely beside my grandfather's antique branding iron. Then, leaning against the doorframe, I listened to the chirping of crickets and the gentle hum of a land finally left undisturbed. People speak of freedom as though it were a grand, abstract concept. It is not. It is fundamentally simple. It is the unequivocal right to inhabit one's own land without external interference or attempts to redefine its boundaries. And for as long as I draw breath, that distinct line upon the earth shall remain unequivocally mine. I have lived long enough to understand that victory rarely manifests precisely as one might anticipate. It is quieter, lacking the spectacle of fireworks. It is more akin to an exhalation that has awaited half a century to be released from one's chest. In these present times, the ranch appears much as it did prior to the emergence of our difficulties. The fences stand uniformly straight, the cattle are robust and placid, and the pond is as transparent as glass. One would never surmise how close it all came to being irrevocably damaged by a handful of individuals who mistakenly believed bureaucratic documentation held more sway than deeply entrenched roots. Occasionally, at sunrise, I walk along the southern perimeter of the property. Dewdrops accumulate on the wire fencing, catching the nascent light and shimmering like threads of silver. Each fence post narrates a story, not merely of boundaries, but of belonging. This is a concept that the urban dwellers consistently fail to grasp. A fence, rather than dividing, serves to define. It articulates a clear statement. This domain is my responsibility to nurture. And this is not born of avarice, but of a profound sense of duty. The elders used to say, "A man's land is the only entity that truly remembers him," is it not? Homes are dismantled, names vanish from plaques, but the soil, the earth, preserves the imprint of your labors, retaining the very shape of your work long after your presence has faded. My grandfather would impart this wisdom to me as he mended fence posts under the relentless summer sun. I had never fully comprehended its depth until this juncture. I have retained the new sign on the gate, the one that reads, "If you are from the HOA, turn around. We remember you. We did not like you." Visitors still pause to capture photographs. Some erupt in laughter, while others nod in silent acknowledgement, as if resonating with its profound sentiment on a deeper level. The majority simply offer a smile and continue on their way, perhaps contemplating their own personal boundaries elsewhere. Rachel sent me a copy of her book last week. It contains an entire chapter dedicated to Sage Hollow, to my story, and to the contributions of Avery, Lindsay, and the other individuals who stood firm when it mattered most. She titled it, "The Line That Held." Inscribed within the front cover, she penned, "To Jed Graves, proof that silence can be more resonant than a gavel." I confess to having little appreciation for ornate rhetoric, but I found that particular phrase compelling because it encapsulated the essence of this entire endeavor. It was about maintaining steadfastness amidst the cacophony of opposing voices. Avery continues to drop by on Sundays for a cup of coffee. Our conversations no longer revolve around legal proceedings or media headlines. We simply sit on the porch, observe the cattle meandering through the pasture, and allow the gentle breeze to fill the ensuing quietude. On occasion, he remarks, "You know, Jed, there are fewer men like you remaining in the world." And I invariably reply, "That is not entirely accurate. There are a multitude. They are simply occupied with repairing fences, while the vociferous ones are preoccupied with dismantling things." Brian is still employed here as well. He is not the same individual who initially arrived in that ostentatious SUV. He now possesses calluses, and the anxious urban demeanor has vanished from his eyes. He speaks sparingly, but his words carry significant weight. We do not engage in discussions about redemption. We are actively living it. The Langston and Ojeda families continue to send holiday cards every Christmas. The land previously belonging to the HOA was subsequently auctioned off. It is now under the ownership of the county park. I drove past it once and observed children flying kites in the very area where the fabricated gates once stood. It appears that some positive outcome has indeed arisen from all that unfortunate turmoil. When the evening light casts its glow upon the pasture at the opportune moment, I can discern the elongated shadows stretching across the land. Mine, my grandfather's, perhaps even my father's, if the wind is benevolent. And I contemplate all the individuals who will follow in my footsteps, and how perhaps someday they too will traverse this same ground and understand that it remained free because someone, at a pivotal juncture, resolved not to cede their position. That, I suppose, is my enduring legacy. Not fame, not headlines, but a fragment of Texas that still possesses a memory of its rightful owner. And should anyone inquire about the cost, I shall offer them the unvarnished truth. Everything truly worthwhile invariably demands a significant price.